13, it might be useful to think about how it would be to make this argument work. I mean, what we're trying to say is that any of the methane must have been released in the atmosphere relatively recently. Why? Because when methane hits sunlight, it breaks down. Well, what we could conclude, knowing that when methane hits sunlight, it breaks down, we can conclude that any methane in the atmosphere hasn't hit sunlight yet. But to say that any methane there must be there recently is to assume that once it stays in the atmosphere for very long, it hits sunlight or is hit by sunlight. And why? Why did we assume that's true? Maybe there's some methane that hides, that hangs out in caves and stuff, never sees the light of day. And if that were true, our whole argument would be blown to shit. You could have methane in there hiding for years. But the argument is assuming that anytime you release methane into the atmosphere, it gets hit by sunlight. And if that's true, if that assumption is added to the argument, then it does sound like if you've got methane in the atmosphere, it must not have been there long enough to get hit by the sun. And that's what answer choice B is pointing out. We've assumed that all the methane is eventually exposed to sunlight, so that if there's methane in the atmosphere, it must have been released recently, because eventually it'll get hit by sun and it'll evaporate.